Hello, we're glad you're here and welcome to this great session, part of the VIA Summit. My name is Rivait. I'm the general manager of the Pattison Media radio stations and news portal here on Vancouver Island. Our markets include Victoria, Nanaimo, Parksville, Qualicum Beach, the Comox Valley, Campbell River, and Port Alberni. We have 8 radio stations and 1 news portal. We're longtime supporters of the VIA conference and very happy to be here presenting and being the sponsor for this session today. Timely, absolutely. So take some notes and get ready for your opportunity to ask some questions at the end of our session. This one I think is really important and something that we talk a lot about in our company. Mental health in the workplace, return to work tools for employers. One day the pandemic will be behind us. We have got people working at home. We've got people in the workplace. How is that all working? Some discussion about the return to work process, some practical and actionable tools for you to use. So I think it's going to be a great session. We also invite you to visit our virtual booth while you're here taking in the virtual VIA conference and the summit this year. Once again, glad you're here, and I hope you enjoy the session.
And I will be your moderator for today's session, Mental Health in the Workplace. I am joining you today from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, including Songhees and Esquimalt nations. I felt honored and blessed to live and work here. Today's session is going to be informative and helpful. We will learn and discuss approaches for employers in supporting return to office and hybrid work. I want to extend a big thank you to Pattison Media, who is sponsoring our session today. So let's meet our panelists. So today our panelists are Christine Birch, founder of Starling Brook Leadership Consulting, Stephanie Woodward, founder of Agency to Change, and Denise Lloyd, founder and CEO of Engaged HR. I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie, as we will first hear from all of our panelists, and then we will open up the session for conversation and discussion with the audience. Stephanie, over to you.
Thanks, and hello, everyone. To kick off this conversation today about mental health and hybrid work, I want to talk about the psychological health and safety in the workplace standard. So this standard is not new. It's not new to hybrid work. It's not new to the pandemic. This is a standard that has been around for a very long time, many, many years. I'm referencing it today for this conversation because it's a framework, and I know this from my work with clients and organizations. This is a framework that you can use to navigate just about anything your business may face, because it's a way of embedding psychological health and psychological safety in your workplace. So as I talk to you about it today, I'll be talking about it through the lens of hybrid work, as well as the pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about the standard. I'm just going to share my slides and tell you a little bit more about the national standard on psychological health and safety in the workplace. And yes, that is a mouthful. And this is a standard that is something that I think we as Canadians can be very, very proud of. It was developed here in Canada through the Canadian Standards Council, and it has global applicability. I've worked with organizations that have offices internationally, and I know these principles and this framework work anywhere in the world. It's also a standard of excellence in this space, and based on multidisciplinary research and decades of research in this space. So you know that you've got something that's evidence-based that's going to help guide you through the psychological health and the psychological safety space. I've also got here that this is a voluntary standard. And I want to really emphasize that because I know, again, that organizations that really think about this standard and put it in place and embed it in their workplaces get great credibility with their employees, because their employees know they're not mandated to do this. So it really signals a strong commitment to mental health in the workplace. There's also talk that this standard might move to mandatory, similar to occupational health and safety. And if that's the case, starting to do some work and starting to familiarize yourselves and moving in this direction will help you really get prepared if that turns out to be the case. So it really is a framework. And as part of this framework, it identifies 13 factors. And that's where I'm going to be spending the bulk of my time today, is introducing you to these factors and seeing how you can use these factors to really put them into practical application and how it can apply to hybrid work, and also return to office if you have people coming back in. So because of this practicality and because of the flexibility within this framework, it can apply to any industry, scalable for a company of any size. It really is something that you can work with and make your own. And I think you'll see that as we go through these factors. So I've mentioned the 13 factors, and I'm going to quickly take you through them. They're quite straightforward. I often say they're simple to understand, and sometimes can be a little less simple in terms of actually doing the work to put them into practice. So that's where the rubber really hits the road when you start to put them into practice. So the first factor is psychological support. And this is all around, and I want you to think of yourself as a leader. I want you to think of your organization. How comfortable are you in checking in with people to see how are you doing really, right? Beyond that kind of how are you doing rhetorical questions. So how comfortable are you in engaging in those conversations with your teams, with individuals in the workplace to check in on how they're doing. Organizational culture is the next factor. And this is all around particularly the values of respect, trust, and fairness. These are going to be really, really important. And your employees are really paying attention to how those play out, and they contribute to psychological health and safety in the workplace. Clear leadership and expectations. This is all around level setting. Are people clear on what's expected of them? Are roles really clarified? Are expectations throughout projects and initiatives really clarified? Civility and respect. How are you trusting each other on a day-to-day basis? Psychological requirements. This is about looking beyond the technical requirements of a role and making sure employees are supported in getting those interpersonal and emotional competencies to do their roles as well. Growth and development, again, contributes to psychological health and safety in the workplace. How are you creating opportunities for growth and development? Is it equitable? Is it fair? And how does that show up in your workplace? Recognition and reward, another huge element here. And this is not just about the annual recognition program. This is around how are you taking time to recognize people on a day-to-day basis? Next, we have involvement and influence. And this is all around how are decisions made? How do you make sure the right people are brought in at the right time to influence the way things are done, to shape how decisions are made? How is that done? Is it equitable? Is it fair? And is it done at the right time? Workload management all around, is there a reasonable amount of time to get the work done that is expected of people? And how is that work prioritized? And how is that workload managed? Next is engagement, all around how connected people feel to their role, how connected they feel to the organization. Balance, we've heard about this elusive concept of balance. It often feels out of our reach, but this is really around recognizing that each of us, we're not just workhorses. We all have a life outside of work. And how are you checking in with your people to see what's going on for them, and recognizing that those things might be out of balance at times, and they might need support and conversations around that. Psychological protection is around how safe it is to bring up concerns, or to come forward and say, hey, I'm really struggling. Do people feel seen, heard, and respected in the workplace when they bring these things forward? And finally, something that's really been top of mind for us over the last year and a half, protection of physical safety. Do people feel physically safe in their work environment? And that's a big part of what we're talking about now when we look at return to office and hybrid. How are we creating those conditions for people? So these 13 factors, there are no organizations that are knocking it out of the park on all 13 of these factors, that would be quite challenging. And just when you make headway on one, sometimes you might go backwards in another one. It's all about having conversations and dialogue. And if you're moving the needle on these 13, you're going to be moving the needle on the conditions for optimal mental health and psychological safety in your workplace. So let's take a look, practical example, because what I really love about these factors is the interplay between them, as opposed to looking at them in isolation. So when we think about return to office, when we think about especially hybrid work, this is really what's coming up for me right now. I'm always a big fan. You'll see at the top of this slide, I've put check-ins. I'm always a big fan of the check-in, the one-on-one check-ins with employees, the team check-ins with employees, because I think that's where you can make a lot of headway on a lot of these factors, simply by being really present with your people and being really present with your teams. And so here I'm showing you how the factors might play out in check-ins, And we'll talk about these through the lens of hybrid work. So on the outside of this circle, you'll see protection of physical safety, because that's the environment we're in right now, right? The entire reason we are doing hybrid work right now is to manage the protection of physical safety for our employees. That's our environment. And now when we go inside the circle, here are some of the factors that are at play in a check-in. When you check in, you have this opportunity to offer that psychological support, to check in, how are you doing really, right? And have those conversations with your people. So when it comes to hybrid work, I want you to think about, and I'm going to say this quite a few times as we go through this, I want you to think about your leadership style default. If you're someone who's in office right now and you have virtual members of your team as well, it might be easy for you to have a casual check-in with someone who happens to pass by your office. Hey, how are you doing? They might offer something up. How are you doing that for your virtual employees? So again, how can you make sure that's equitable and fair, and that you're checking in depending on what your default is, whether you're virtual or in office? How are you providing that psychological support? Next, we've got workload management. So again, this is all about checking in, prioritizing workload. Again, looking at this through hybrid work, you may have a default setting where you love bringing a scrum together in person in the office. Well, what does that look like when half of your people are in office and half of them are virtual? How will you be structuring those prioritization meetings to manage workload? How are you checking in one-on-one with people? And are you making sure you're doing that on a consistent basis and in an equitable and consistent basis across those two different cohorts of workers, whether they're working virtually or whether they're in office? Clear leadership and expectations. Again, this is the opportunity to level set. And here again, if your default is to be in office, it can be easy. Someone will come by with a quick question, or someone will drop by your office, and you can naturally and spontaneously get into those conversations. In hybrid work, you may need to put more structure around this. How are you making sure that you're checking in with both groups? How can you make sure expectations are clear across all of these groups and that communication flow is happening? So really be paying attention to that as well. Finally, balance. Again, everybody is going to have different circumstances over the current months. This is always true, but it's been especially true over the last year and a half. And that I think will continue as we face hybrid work. So checking in with where people are at and making sure that's happening consistently with virtual workers and those who are in office as well. Next practical example. This again, I'm going to assume that you're now doing these check-ins, assume that you're checking in one-on-one with people, assume that you're checking in with your team. So here we have your overall leadership style and how you'll be approaching hybrid work. You'll see in the environment here, outside of this circle, we still have protection of physical safety. I've also placed psychological support outside of this circle because I'm going to assume through the one-on-ones and through those team check-ins, you're really checking in with people to check to see how they're really doing. So your approach to leadership here, clear leadership and expectations, I spoke about on the previous slide. And again, check in. The best thing you can do right now is deepen your own self-awareness around your leadership style. What feels most comfortable to you and what's your default? Because you really will have to create a way of being consistent between, again, those two sets of workers, whether they're in office or virtual. This will be especially true for involvement and influence. So as decisions need to be made, as you're approaching projects, how are you making sure that everyone has a voice when they might be in two different locations? And they're not all connected as one team in one physical location. So putting in place the right protocols, putting in place that structure that's going to help you do that and make sure people feel like they have equal access to share their opinions, share their ideas, and get involved in what they need to get involved in. And finally, engagement, those opportunities for team building, those opportunities for celebration. Thinking about, it will take some extra thought to think about how am I going to be doing that when I have teams that are virtual and teams that are in office. So really putting some thought aside to think, how can I connect people to their work? How can I be creating these moments to gather engagement and build engagements with the team? So that is just a little bit to show you how you can put these factors into play. I'm a trained advisor in this space. So if you have any questions at any point around any of this, please do reach out. We'll be sharing contact information at the end of this presentation. And now I will pass it over to my colleague, Christine.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. And if you wouldn't mind, oh, that's perfect. Thanks so much. So as Stephanie mentioned, to be able to create psychological support requires us to be able to do some check-ins. And I want to say the number one question that I get whenever I do leadership training around mental health in the workplace is, how do I recognize when someone's not doing so well? And as you can see by some of the stats that Stephanie had behind her and behind myself, and you'll also see from Denise, mental health and COVID has been on the rise. We've already had mental health issues prior. 1 in 5 Canadians has been diagnosed with a mental health disorder. And during the pandemic, it has heightened those stats and people's illnesses as well. And so when you're in the workplace, I often get, so how do I recognize? How do I know if someone's not doing well? There are some obvious things that we look for, and those are things like attendance, lateness, quality of work, mood. And these are things that perhaps might be a little bit easier to identify or recognize when we are working together. What happens when we are working remotely and we haven't gone back to the workplace, or we will continue to have some sort of a hybrid model? I want to share with you some of the ways that we might be able to recognize when someone's not doing so well. So one of them is not turning cameras on. Now, again, not turning cameras on for us, that, I might be having a bad hair day or there's chaos going on behind me. It doesn't mean anything. But if you're having one-on-ones, and especially during the check-in and people are not turning their camera on, it just may be a flag or an indicator for me. I need to ask a little bit more questions beyond the how are you doing? It's a great place to start. How else can we keep digging? Lack of participation. Maybe you've noticed that people just aren't as participating as much as they used to. Could be Zoom fatigue. It could be a number of things, but you just noticed that change. Or lack of focus. Perhaps making decisions a little bit slower in getting to decisions. Working longer hours yet are less productive. So it looks like I'm on all the time. I'm checking emails. I may be on Slack. I may be doing whatever tools you use to communicate. I'm working a lot of hours, but my productivity hasn't improved. I'm impatient. So before, and as leaders, let me just pause here for a second. This isn't just about our employees. This is also about us. And so what is our patience level like? Maybe there's excuses and lots of them as to why work isn't getting done. One of the other ones is around waiting to be told to do things. This one's interesting. I just want to throw out a stat that the largest age demographic in the workplace that is diagnosed with anxiety disorder is millennials. So our Gen Ys. And you may have hired somebody and this person has been working really hard and diligently, and you really enjoy and appreciate that they are a self-starter. And lately you've noticed that they've been waiting to be told to do things or needing a lot of feedback. And we're like, what's going on with this change in performance? Because I hired you because you're a self-starter and you know what you're doing. And now it's like you're waiting all the time. Well, that is a hallmark of anxiety. And with so many people diagnosed with anxiety disorder in the workplace, this may be an indicator that somebody's not doing so well. Also, tone of voice. This is an interesting one. So years of executive coaching, I did face-to-face mostly. And then as I started working globally, I didn't understand why people wouldn't want to fly me on an airplane to Dubai for an hour of coaching. I don't get it, but I had to learn how to coach by phone. And when you listen to voice, so without seeing people, but hearing, you can start to listen for hitches in breathing. So if somebody's not doing well or there's something that's troubling them, we can hear it in the tone of voice and the way people breathe. So those two things are important. Also, tone of voice belies our emotion. So when we're impatient or we're not in a good space, it does come out in our tone of voice. So when we hear all this, we do a check-in, we've gone beyond the, hey, how are you doing? And then you notice a couple of these other things that are going on. And you think, what might be going on? Before entering into a conversation, I just want to share a lot of times what triggers the need beyond a check-in is a change in performance, a change in behavior, a change in mood. There's some change, whatever it might be for the employee. Although I've given you some indicators here, it could be a number of things. They may mean something, they may mean nothing. And the only way you're going to know is if you continue the conversation. So I want to give you a model on how to enter into a concerned coaching conversation when you notice a change for your employee. There are 3 steps to this: describe, declare, and review. I want to start prior to even going into the conversation, just we ourselves. So you've noticed this change. It tends to elicit an emotion in us. And usually that emotion is either disappointment or frustration or anger. Like, why isn't this getting done? Why do I need to chase you for work? I'm already stressed myself. What's going on? And when there's that emotion I mentioned before comes out in our tone. So when we're going into a conversation with someone, if we are carrying that emotion with us, or we've made up a story about what we think is going on with the individual, it doesn't feel safe to start the conversation. They will hear the tone in our voice, which will put people on edge and will make people feel defensive. And then we are trying to just get something out, which puts kind of makes us just feel like we're doing a dump and run. We get it out and then we just want to be done. Before starting this conversation, I'd like us to get to a place of an emotional regularity. And what that means is get yourself into a 2 C's, concerned and curious place. Because when you are curious, you can't have a negative emotion. You can't be angry, you can't be frustrated, you can't be impatient. When you are curious, it makes us more open-minded. So think about being curious and concerned. There's a change. So the first thing, so before going in, we've done all that. Now describe what you've seen. Actually have something that you've seen that is an observable behavior, whether it's lateness, the cameras, whatever it is, use that. And then when we start the conversation, it's always an I. I've noticed. So I've noticed, Christine, that in our last couple of one-to-ones, your camera hasn't been turned on. And this is a change because typically you have your cameras on, and I like to talk to you about what's preventing you or impacting your ability to turn your camera on. And so I want to start the conversation in a pretty neutral place, not making the person wrong with the behavior, but I've noticed this. It's a change from a typical pattern for you. Then the next thing I'd said a what question. I also want to say, as leaders, when we are nervous entering this conversation or whatever other emotion we may be, we might start with, is everything okay? And is everything okay is a closed-ended question. That leaves your employee 2 places to go. Yes, no. And most likely, no matter what's going on at home, people say, yeah, no, everything's fine. Sorry, small little blip, we'll get over it. It's important to ask open-ended questions because the open-ended questions allow people to be able to share as little or as much as they need to share. So some good practices around that, just using what questions. I know with open-ended questions, there's who, what, why, where, when, and how. Out of all those, there's one we should never start this conversation, and it's why. Like, why am I seeing this change? Or why is this happening? Why puts us on the defense? So 2 points with this. I want to make sure it's a concerned coaching conversation. So you're curious, you're concerned, you're going to show empathy by asking what questions and having a very neutral tone. So you can ask the employee some things that are going on, what's preventing you or what's impacting your ability to do something, and then listen to what they say. And when I say listen, I mean really actively listen. So not the listen of your mind is already coming up with the next question or a retort to what you've heard, but actually just pausing and listening and then acknowledging what you've heard. So you have a lot going on in your personal life right now, and that's what's preventing you from doing A, B, and C. Then I'm gonna add in some empathy and acknowledgement. And I might say something like this: I can appreciate that must be frustrating for you because somebody who's a high performer not being able to do X, Y, and Z must be pretty frustrating. There you validate and acknowledge how they are feeling. This is the number one thing we need to do for empathy. In all of this conversation, it's not about us getting to, I see a change and I need you to change it so we can move on. It's not a change and fix it kind of scenario. It's I see it, I want to identify it, I want to have a conversation with you about what this means to you and then what we can do. You probably will have to have 2 or 3 of these conversations because people are not going to be comfortable if it's a mental health issue. Less than 33% of employees are going to share if they've been diagnosed with a mental health disorder or experiencing mental health issues. Why? Because we're scared. We're scared we don't know what you're going to do with the information once we share it. The other thing, and so the last part of this is review. So review what the employee has suggested and said. I'd also ask you not to problem solve for the person. You probably have lots of great solutions. Here's a great place to practice asking more questions around how the employee can solve this. What supports do they need? What are they noticing at work? How are they noticing this impacting their work? So maybe I'm noticing somebody's coming late to meetings. In addition to coming late, what else are you noticing? What other impacts are there? Let them share more and then ask them, what can they do about this? Because as a leader, you have two things. You have the needs of the organization to get work done, and you have the need to support your employee. So both of those things are equally as important. So you want to make sure work gets done, but we also want to ask employees how they're going to do that. So have your employee suggest some things. I've also often hear leaders say the very first question they say is, how can I help? That's a great question, but please let that be last, because as soon as you insert yourself, now this has become your issue. I would wait, ask more questions, and at the end, ask the employee, what supports do you need? What do you need from me? Where can I be supportive? And then if you have something like an employee family assistance program at work and an employee doesn't want to share that much, you might want to ask them if they're aware of what resources you have available for them towards the tail end of the conversation to see if that they would be interested. The last part is review. Review your conversation, review what the employee has shared. So if I've heard you correctly, you've got some things that are going on in your personal life right now, and that's impacting your ability to do X, Y, and Z. And you're going to do A, B, and C to address that. And we're going to address that in the next 2 weeks. Okay, great. Now, in the meantime, at the end of 2 weeks, let's circle back and have another conversation to see where you're at. And then we can take it from there. So a couple of things as I close this part off, it's important to have the conversation, but what's more important is regulating your emotions, entering the conversation, making sure we're concerned and curious, and that we're providing a lot of space and opportunity for people to share. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Denise, because at times we may get nowhere in this conversation. And then what are we going to do?
Thanks, Christine. I appreciate that. It's so true. There is a point in time where things shift, and we need to start looking at the situation from the point of view of what is it as an employer that I need to do to make sure that we continue to move forward. Because as Christine mentioned, there's business to be done and work to be done. And we can continue to have conversations over and over, but at a certain point, we need to move forward. So bringing back to a lot of what Stephanie talked about and a lot of what Christine talked about, wanting to talk about how do you then move forward? What are the things you need to do? And I'm going to share my screen as we talk about that, because I want you to stay present with the ideas that Christine talked about in terms of your empathy, in terms of staying curious and continuing to have non-judgmental, safe conversations. Because even as you move forward and as you talk about the components that are not improving with an employee, that does not mean that you need to stop being psychologically safe in your interactions. It doesn't mean that you need to stop coming at things from an empathetic place. You can still do those. You can still engage in a way that connects you to the individual and walks with them down a path. And you can start bringing into the conversation the expectations that are aligned with good performance and moving forward. So part of that is we go back to this model that Stephanie shared with us. You'll remember the conversations about clear leadership and involvement, influence, and engagement. I've maintained that model in this conversation because of how important it is to continue the psychological support and the protection of physical safety. Those foundations are in this conversation. Then you have the conversation with an employee that continues to stay safe and sets clear guidelines that helps the employee understand the difference between the performance that's expected and the performance that's being seen. So again, going back to Christine's model of the concerned conversation, you are continuing to talk about what you're observing. What are you seeing? And talking about what's the difference between what you're seeing and what's expected. As we've moved through this conversation, the phrase from Brene Brown keeps coming up of clear is kind. And the clearer you can be in this conversation, the easier it is for people to understand what's expected of them. It also allows them to be involved in the conversation. The concerned conversation that Christine talked about allows people to be involved and to influence and co-create what is it that has to happen. And it allows them to stay engaged. Now, sometimes, as we talked about, things don't go according to plan. We have great plans, we talk, we review, we talk, we review, and things don't change. So that's where you need to start looking at some of the other tools that become available to you as an employer. Because as an employer, you do have a responsibility to engage with the employee and to move things forward with things like perhaps there's an accommodation that's needed of some kind, or perhaps there's a leave that's required, so that the employee can focus on what they need to focus on to help them stabilize, to help them come back to themselves in their work. And so this is where your conversations can take place. They can still be very safe. And maybe it's talking about how a hybrid work model, for example, doesn't work for this particular employee for particular reasons, and they need an accommodation of some kind to help it work for them. So now you're getting more specific in your conversation about what that might look like. Maybe accommodation is, instead of 3 times a week coming into the office, it's twice a week, which gives them time to be more flexible in a work from home situation where they can manage perhaps some of their own self-care. Maybe they need to make time for particular counseling appointments or particular workout. They want to go to yoga, in 2 o'clock in the afternoon on one day of the week, because that's what's going to help them. Maybe it's a counseling appointment that they have to make time for. Each individual employee is going to have their own needs, whatever their own plan is for helping them stabilize and helping them be in a good place. So accommodation is helping understand what is it for them and how does the employer support them in their things while still getting the employer's needs met. It's a relationship. This is about both the employee and the employer. And it's not just about how do you support the employee. There's a relationship that we're in here that needs to be balanced. And so the conversations about what is it that's going to work for the employee, what is going to work best for the employer in terms of that design, can then be acknowledged and supported and reviewed and documented. So you're now moving to a place where there is more documentation. You are being more clear about what is it that the employee is going to do and by when. You're perhaps getting medical professionals involved depending on the situation, and you're making sure that the documentation that you're receiving from medical professionals is helping move you forward towards the end result that your goal is. So as you manage all of this, this really is, as the employer, your responsibility from a risk management point of view. All of it grounded in dignity and support and psychological safety and all of the different components that Stephanie worked through with us, making sure that that safe conversation is coming from a place of support and caring and empathy, while also managing your documentation. This also provides employees with an opportunity to intervene, with an opportunity to speak to what's going to work for them. And so I go back to that involvement and influence, because so much of whatever solution you're going to design needs to come from and be supported by the employee. This allows you to continue to have those conversations and evolve the situation. So an accommodation may last for a short period of time. It may start with a leave and turn into a gradual return to work. It looks like many different things. All of it comes together when you start those conversations in that concerned way that Christine talked about. So the integration of all these different components starts to give us a grounding in the frameworks that employers need when it comes time, if it comes time, to move the relationship to a different outcome, whether that's an accommodation leave or potentially ending the employment relationship. So making sure that as you've worked through these processes, you are protecting yourself as an employer, because you do have that responsibility for risk management, and at the same time protecting the employee and making sure you've given every opportunity for the situation to support and resolve itself in some way. And employers often come to us when they want to talk about these situations with they've already made up their mind that they just need to end their relationship. And they're tired, they don't know what else to do, and they just want to end. And we need to take a step back at that point, and we need to talk about what more could we do and what else can we do that perhaps looks different than what you've done before. And we need to manage our mindset as we go through that. And we continue to remind ourselves that the empathy of the situation and the need to take a look at things from an as objective a place as possible will give you a lot more options. It opens your mind to all the different ways the situation could resolve itself, and not just from the tired place of, we just need to end this. So the psychological safety component is a big part of why we brought this into this model, is because so much of that protects all of us in this process. This is hard on the employees. It's hard on you. If you go through as this with a barreling through approach to, I just want this to be over. And so part of what we wanted to share in all of this is a protection of the psychological safety of both yourself as well as the employee when you go through these conversations, and making sure that as we work our way through this model, that we are protecting everyone that's involved in the situation and giving everyone space to get their needs met. So I think as we've talked, I've really appreciated from Stephanie and Christine the different ways that we've been able to layer psychological safety and support for employees into the outcome that this then brings us to, whatever that outcome might be, and has allowed us the opportunity to stay open to whatever outcome is possible. So with that, I think I'll just share some contact details so that you know each of us and our work that we do. And as you recall, Stephanie started us off from agency to change with the psychological safety factors. Christine talked about the coaching conversations from Starbuck Leadership. And then I with Engaged HR, and we work with organizations on all things people associated with human resources. So having said that, Kristi, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Denise, Stephanie, and Christine. That was a really informative conversation, and I really look forward to furthering our discussion with the audience. So let's open it up for questions and Q&A and comments to the audience. Please feel free to also write in the chat box, and we will make sure that some of your questions are answered. So thanks again, and let's open it up. Thanks, everyone. That was really great. So I welcome any of our audience to really put some questions in the chat box or raise your hand and let us see. You're welcome to put your videos back on, and we can have a conversation with these amazing women that have taught us so much. Maybe I'll just start off, and maybe I'll start with Stephanie. So you sort of talked a little bit around understanding our leadership styles as a way to be able to implement some of these strategies, and it comes back to our leadership style a lot. Is there a way for us to learn? Is there some suggestions of how we deepen our understanding of what types of leaders we are, so that we can constantly and continually provide these psychological supports and maybe see things we might not be seeing about ourselves?
Oh, I love this question, Kristi. And I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible in the response, because obviously there are so many books, there are so many assessment tools, there are so many things we can turn to. But I think sometimes self-observation and getting honest with yourself. So even if you make a practice at the end of the day to say to yourself, what did I notice? Like, what is my default? How comfortable, if I'm being honest with myself, how comfortable am I in having these conversations with my team? How much space did I make to create a one-on-one today? Did I find myself turning to task versus relationship today? So even just journaling, if you're a journaler, or verbally dictating, taking 1 or 2 minutes at the end of the day to reflect back on what your default was through that day, that can be a really simple practice that doesn't require money, just the discipline of doing it every day.
Thanks, Stephanie. How about we go over to Christine? How do you know the difference, Christine, let's say between something that might be a mental health issue or it's actually a performance issue?
Great question. I wish I had $1 for every time at a leader training somebody asked me, how do I know the difference? How do I actually know? Like, I don't know. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. How am I supposed to know if it's a mental health issue? Well, here's my simple answer to that. And you don't. And you won't. And so often in the workplace, what happens is there's a change in performance. And then that's the thing that flags or triggers for us. Like, whoa, I got to pay attention. Something's going on over here. And because it's a change in performance, we tend to think it's a performance issue. And so as I mentioned earlier with the example of anxiety disorder, there may be an underlying mental health issue. It may be stress, it may be anxiety, it could be people are experiencing depression. If you look at the background on the three of us, our backgrounds, you see during COVID, what's been happening with anxiety disorder and depression. And so we see a lot more of this, but we don't see the illness in knowing like, oh, that's a mental health issue. We see it in a behavior. So that's why it's important to look for the changes of behavior. And so the way you will maybe find out is when you start your conversation around, I see this change and I want to talk to you about what this change means. And so not going in with any assumptions. I'm not going to assume it's a mental health issue and I'm not going to assume it's a performance issue. I just want to explore to see what it potentially could be. I think the challenge for us is when we go in thinking it's a performance issue, we miss the opportunity that it might be something else. And if we don't open the conversation in a certain way, as employees, we're scared to say anything. So if you come at me with, I'm going to say that projection of you've done something wrong and we need to talk about it and I want you to fix it, there's no way in hell I'm going to tell you that I may be experiencing some mental health struggles or challenges right now. So that's why I really, you won't know the difference. But I hope from today, what you do take away is that performance issue might just not be a performance issue. There may be something behind that.
Thank you. I want to go to the audience here. A question here. What happens? This is a great question as well. What happens when it's the leaders or the business owners? They need the stress management potentially themselves. Like, what resources or suggestions do you have in this case for employees or staff?
All right, which one of us want to take that one?
We're flipping it on its head.
You know what? I'm happy to jump in right out of the gate and say we know that that saying of put your own oxygen mask on first before you support others. So again, if I look at this through the lens of the factors that we talked about, how are you giving psychological support to yourself? Are you checking how am I doing really? And checking in with yourself. What do I need? Am I physically exhausted, mentally exhausted? Emotionally exhausted, what's going on for me? It goes back to that self-observation, getting to know yourself, and giving yourself that permission to give yourself what you need first. So I'll start with that as a tip and hand it over to Christine or Denise with some extras.
Yeah, I'll jump in there because I think, a big part of this question is about managing up. So when you have your leader is someone that you can tell is struggling and is not acknowledging it. And as a leader, one of the things that we forget to do is take care of ourselves, to oxygen mask first. But also sometimes we lose our own sense of awareness and we aren't always aware of how we are being perceived or the impact that we're having. One of the most supportive things you can do for a leader is ask them how they're doing in a psychologically safe way and to give them the opportunity to actually take a breath and say, I've had a rough week, and to actually know that they have someone in the organization that they can share that with in a safe way that isn't going to be spread around the organization. It's not going to become gossip, and they can really just experience what it means to be supported inside the organization, because then you can start having conversations about what I'm observing is this and what I'm observing is that, and I'm worried about you, or I wondered how I can help you, whatever the kinds of conversations you feel you can have. But it's asking those questions to your leaders the same way you would with your staff.
And I think as I hear this question and the responses, one of the things I think about often is it's hard to ask your leader a question about how they're doing if this isn't a typical way of engaging with your leader. And so if it's out of the norm, it's going to feel really awkward and scary. And you're like, what's the repercussions to me to say something? And so we get scared. I want to share a personal story around that. Years ago, so I used to work at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And when I was there, I ended up with a concussion. And the doctor had suggested I take some time off, but oh, no. That's for other people. I don't need time off. I'm good. So I came to work every day. And while I was at work, I was struggling. I'd be in my office crying. I didn't even know what came over me. I'd have to close my door. I'm like crying over nothing. So I'm having lunch with a colleague, a psychiatrist. And I said, Peter, what's wrong with me? And he says, you have a brain injury and you're experiencing some mental health issues right now. You need to take time off. I'm like, oh, I'm fine. Anyways, en masse, my team came to see me a couple of weeks later, closed the door and said, could you please take time off? We can see that you're struggling and you're not doing really well. You need to take time off. And I was like, no, I can't, because I need to be here for you. And they said, they said, really? So one of them piped up and said, if this was us, so if one of us got hurt and we came into work and we were struggling, what would you say to us? And I said, well, I would tell you to go home, of course. And they said, you're making the workplace unsafe for us, Christine, because what you say and what you do is not in alignment. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. I went, wow, here I am thinking I'm doing my best being here, taking care of everybody. I've got your back. But really what I was saying to them was, it's not okay to be sick. I expect you to come to work because that's what the pressure I put on myself. So starting those conversations small and building up to those conversations. And if somebody does have a great relationship with the leader, I would encourage maybe we support them to start the conversation with the leader as we all show our support to that person.
So another question from the audience is around tools that might exist to survey the team's personalities that leaders can use to have a deeper understanding of their teammates' personality tendencies prior to potentially challenging situations. Do you know of any tools that exist?
I can jump. Yeah. So I can, so from a leadership development perspective, I mean, there are many assessment tools. I will say I have a personal bias against personality type of tools. And here's the only reason being. One, I came from a mental health facility where assessments, if I get a personality assessment, what do I do with it? So I know that I'm a creator on the team dimensions. So does that mean I only get to brainstorm? So when it comes to executing, I don't get to show up. So I really like tools that help in understanding how teams behave and how people like to interact. So I say anything that allows you to share your strengths, anything that allows you to share your values. And this doesn't even need to be a tool. You can just come up with hey, let's share our top 5 values and what it means to us in the workplace. And how does that look from a behavior perspective is a great way to just get to understand everybody and what's important to them and gives them meaning and purpose. Via Strength Finders is free. It will give you your 24 type of leadership or 24 strengths. There's also Strengths Finder 2.0. And if you want to do some assessments, I would say the emotional intelligence. So the 2.0, emotional intelligence 2.0 assessments will give you a sense of how your teams coalesce and work well together. And I'll turn it to Denise or Stephanie for any additional ones.
Jump in as well. And I had the same frustration as Christine with some assessments where it can end up putting people in a box. And that's when I discovered the Enneagram tool. So I use the Enneagram tool in workplaces, which is fantastic for team dynamics. And the whole premise of the Enneagram is not about putting people in a box, but helping you understand your strengths and challenges so that you can grow beyond them, grow beyond those personality fixations and patterns. So I do that work with teams, and it can be really, really transformational to look at the tendencies and the dynamics within the team. So that's a great resource as well.
Thank you for sharing those. Here's a really interesting question. Regarding the employee check-ins, what advice or suggestions can you offer if you have an employer, like if your employer is having a really